the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature, when those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. That state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended, with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. Hence arises the great power of the sublime. It anticipates our reasonings and hurries us on by an irresistible force. This is the Irish statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke's treatise on the sublime, published in 1757 at the height of the Enlightenment period. While Enlightenment luminaries from Diderot to Voltaire advocated for reason and clarity, Burke was investigating this profound, enigmatic emotional phenomenon, far mightier than the logical mind. Philosophers have tried to define it, architects have attempted to fabricate it, and artists have immortalized it in paint, the seizing awe of incalculable enormity and inconceivable vastness, that arresting tension between delight and dread, a visceral reaction to the reigning forces that swallow and smother us: space, time, death, nature. I'm in the Catskill Mountains in New York's Hudson Valley region, about 100 miles north of the city. It's invigorating to be off the grid, to be enveloped, even a little intimidated by the terrain, which was here long before me and will hopefully be here long after I'm gone. No wonder Thomas Cole felt a deep, divine connection to this place. What a far cry from the smoggy harbors and infernal factories of his early life in northwest England. Born in Lancashire in 1801, Cole came of age amid the Industrial Revolution. Worlds away from the luxury and leisure enjoyed by the elite, Cole's England was becoming increasingly overpopulated and overworked, polluted, and poor. In his youth, Cole toiled in a textile factory, engraving wooden blocks used to produce affordable printed fabrics called calicos. His father ran a wool manufacturing business, but he struggled to keep up with his rapidly modernizing industry. He herded the family around England in search of better prospects until 1818, when the Coles departed for the more promising shores of America. They arrived here in Philadelphia, but soon enough, Cole's father was on the move again, attempting to reinvent himself as a manufacturer of wallpapers in the neighboring state of Ohio. Given his experience as an engraver, Cole had an eye for design, which was well suited to the new family venture. But he also had an intrepid spirit, and he craved beauty and meaning. So when he fortuitously crossed paths with a traveling painter by the name of Stein, Cole's purpose became clear. This is the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, America's oldest art school, founded in 1805. This place boasts legendary alumni, from Mary Cassatt to Henry Ossawa Tanner, Barclay L. Hendricks, and David Lynch. But long before all of them, Cole was here, studying and soaking up the creations of his contemporaries. such as Thomas Doty, a local leather courier turned painter who, like Cole, traded a life of industry for art. Of course, America was still a new nation, so landscape painting was only just beginning to emerge here with its own distinctive flavor. What early landscapists like Doty offered was a continuation of the subdued pastoral style that was popular in Europe. But the majestic forests and rugged, reaching mountains characterizing the Northeast were deserving of a more epic celebration, and Cole, who started off painting portraits and genre scenes, heard the primal American countryside call out for an impassioned visual language, the language of the sublime. Cole moved from Philadelphia to New York City in the spring of 1825 and made his inaugural journey up the Hudson River by steamboat. He came here to the imposing Catskill Falls, the highest cascading waterfall in New York State. What a spectacular subject for an aspiring landscape painter. The sheer density and diversity of the terrain and the constantly shifting light posed a challenge for Cole, who was captivated by this natural wonder and the formidable Catskill region at large. He developed a practice of sketching the environment, but also noting how it felt to be in it. That way, he could take creative liberties that amplified the atmosphere of a scene. Cole summered in the Catskills, but he also maintained a Manhattan studio for a time. In the winter of 1827, he lived here on Green Street in Soho. When he returned to the city after his first upstate sojourn, Cole successfully placed a few of his new landscapes in a Manhattan shop. His depiction of Catskill Falls caught the eye of an already established artist who made it his mission to see this young talent get his due. His name was John Trumbull, the so-called painter of the American Revolution. Taken with the drama and the romance of Cole's landscapes, Trumbull purchased Falls of Catskill for himself and brought the other two artworks, View of Fort Putnam and View of Lake with Dead Trees, to the attention of his peers, the artist, historian, and theater producer William Dunlap, and the engraver Asher Brown Durand. With the help of his new advocates, Cole was swept up in the nascent New York art scene, his work coveted by patrons and lauded by like-minded creatives, such as the newspaper editor and poet William Cullen Bryant and the author James Fenimore Cooper. Between 1826 and 27, Cole painted 4 scenes inspired by Cooper's recently published story, The Last of the Mohicans. Cole was also among a coalition of visionaries who co-founded the National Academy of Design. Established in 1825, the institution promoted the artists and designers leading the way in American visual culture. And while Cole's work may appear archaic compared to the modern and contemporary art on view here at the Met, he was a pioneer of the first distinctly American art movement. This is the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This collection area alone accounts for about 20,000 artworks and objects by European American, Latin American, African American, and Native American artists from the colonial period to the early modern period. The Met's been acquiring American art since its establishment in 1870 and allotted a special space for its exhibition in 1924. The American Wing has since evolved to include the dreamy Charles Engelhard Court, period rooms that immerse us in American domestic life through the centuries, and sculpture as well as painting galleries. Watched over by none other than Thomas Cole, this gallery is dedicated to the formative years of what's known as the Hudson River School.
Well, Thomas Cole was a British artist, and his early childhood is very important to consider in that he was born in Bolton-le-Moor on the northwestern coast of England, which was the very heart of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And he and his family suffered greatly from, the arrival of, factories with belching smoke. He grew up in a town that you could barely breathe the air. And so he was very aware of the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. And when he saw the northeastern landscape, this vision took hold that this should be the subject of his art, and then decided he needed to return to Europe, to England and Italy, to really educate himself in the old world traditions of art. In 1828, several of his patrons pulled together enough money for him to go on the grand tour. And he goes to London first and actually saw the very early opening of the London National Gallery. And he would meet the great artists of the day. He met Turner, who he was absolutely fascinated by, and learned from Turner the importance and power of history painting, how you can embed moral messages in history paintings, and the ways in which Turner used sublime elements of nature to indicate moral messages, like big storms. And then he would meet John Constable, who was the great painter of clouds. And then his time in Italy was very important in that he went to the Vatican, and we have his diaries of all of the works that he admired in the Vatican collections. He was obsessed with Claude Lorrain and the picturesque and sublime early elements of landscape art in the 17th century. But he spent most of his time traveling to ruins. He would spend endless time in the Colosseum and painting paintings of the Colosseum. And then he went outside of Rome to do plein air studies of the aqueducts, the ruins, great ruins of the aqueducts. He went to Naples, where he was just obsessed with the rise and decline of this great civilization, and how ultimately man's crassness led to the decline and destruction, but nature would always survive, even though man did not. He brought all of that back with him in the early 1830s to find that Andrew Jackson, the new president, was starting to implement exactly what he had left in England, which was the destruction of the wilderness. So we really describe Cole as the first proto-environmental painter in the United States. And his greatest painting and his manifesto to American citizens was the Oxbow. And so in his Catskill studio, he had been for 10 years thinking about the site called the Oxbow, which was on the Connecticut River. He's taken a position from Mount Holyoke, this mountain just south of Northampton, Massachusetts, looking down at this, what was considered a sort of spiritual God-made natural wonder, the Oxbow, which interestingly, in Cole's painting that we see here, he creates as almost a question mark in the river. And what he does is really a radical new composition where he introduces the panoramic mode, the sweeping panorama that moves from left to right, which would become a signature of the Hudson River School. But what he does is to bifurcate the landscape, where you see pure wilderness, God's creation on the left, with a sublime thunderstorm moving across. And that sort of swirling vortex was directly inspired by Turner's great paintings, particularly Hannibal crossing the Alps, which he had seen in London. And then on the right side, you look down from sort of this godlike perch down to the valley below, and you see cultivated lands that have been completely altered by man. And so what he does is to have a collision between man's overtaking of nature and God's pure creation. It's like a rupture. And so it was his manifesto. He's like asking you, are you going to preserve the great sublime aspects of nature, or are you going to destroy all of it?
Beginning in the late 1820s, Cole began to map out a cycle of paintings that would trace the tragic arc of a civilization. He won a commission for this ambitious vision from the New York merchant Luman Reed, who's pictured here in this portrait by Asher B. Durand at the New York Historical Society. Reed died in 1836, but his family encouraged Cole to forge ahead, and later that year he completed the series, which he called The Course of Empire. Dawn breaks over the savage state. The world is new and mysterious to humankind. They hunt and dance and take shelter in the wilderness, the smoke from their humble fires devoured by a turbulent sky. The Arcadian state is clement and clear. Generations have passed, and humans have learned the land. As they nurture it, it nurtures them in kind. Now they thrive in their splendid city and exact dominion over nature. They no longer worship the land, but their own leaders and gods. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, presides over the empire as a pillar of virtue, but she's elevated to such a great height that she's forgotten. The people want for nothing in the consummate state, but beneath the glittering marble facade, rot is setting in. Wisdom bows to war in a riotous clash. Fire, once a tool for survival and prosperity, is weaponized, and smoke from the blaze suffocates the dusky sky. Night falls on the desolate ruins as nature slowly, silently, and surely reclaims her domain. So goes the course of empire.
Cole conceived of this series in 1829. He was abroad on a trip in Europe, going to the British Museum, visiting the Roman ruins, and he had this idea for a magnum opus that could encompass all of his philosophical and aesthetic interests. And he jotted down in his sketchbook that he wanted to paint a series illustrating the mutation of terrestrial things, and that is what developed into the course of empire 7 years later. Well, this was Cole's great ambition to create a higher style of landscape. He, in his words, didn't want to be a mere leaf painter. So they are landscapes, but they carry this story about the fate of empires and about the transience of humankind's makings in the face of constant nature. So really, what Cole was able to do was to elevate this genre of landscape, then considered really a lesser genre, and imbue it with the force and the magnitude and the grandeur and the weightiness of exalted history painting. Cole likely intended this series as a warning to the United States. He was conservative. He identified with the Whig Party. He believed in moral restraint. He believed in governance by the educated elite, and he believed in an ordered social hierarchy. And what he feared was the demise of these values under President Andrew Jackson, who was considered a man of the people, an outsider to the political establishment. What Cole saw under his rule was a nation expanding too quickly, settling the land too eagerly, using natural resources erroneously seen as limitless too quickly, and he saw and feared the rise of populism. To me, what is really telling is where and how he signs his name. So, for example, in the first scene, you have his signature on a rock. This is the scene of incipient civilization. It's just beginning to form, and the way he's painted his name on the rock looks almost like an early form of art making. In the second scene, he signs his name under a boy who's drawing on the bridge. That boy is symbolic of the birth of the visual arts. So Cole is associating himself with the birth of the visual arts. In the third scene, his signature is very stylized and pristine and beautiful. It appears on one of the gleaming white architectural features, and the style of the writing, picks up on the architectonic style of the scene and the geometry of all of those buildings, the very clean, stark geometry. The fourth scene, his signature is slashed onto the pedestal on which this decapitated warrior stands. A statue of a decapitated warrior stands. And that is the scene in which the civilization implodes in violence and chaos. And so it's almost like Cole, with his slashing strokes, is participating in that violence and chaos. And then in the fifth scene, most poignantly, we have his signature on an architectural fragment, but that fragment has fallen. So we actually see his signature upside down in the bottom right-hand corner, and vegetation is growing over his name. So he too is part of the makings of humankind that has fallen back to the earth and is being overtaken by nature.
This is Cole's beloved Cedar Grove, now the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. It belonged to a local merchant by the name of John A. Thompson before it became Cole's permanent residence in 1836 when he married Thompson's niece, Maria Bartow. Cole loved this place with its stunning view of the Catskills, and it was here that he created some of his most inspired works of art.
Cedar Grove is the historic name for this property, and we also call it the Thomas Cole National Historic Site today. And we still have the same view today that we had then of the whole Catskill Mountain range. And that was a view that Thomas Cole painted over and over. It was his favorite spot. He called it a favorite haunt of mine to go hiking down by the creek at the bottom of the hill and paint those mountains. So it is a place that immediately looks like a Thomas Cole painting when you arrive. And I say to people, I don't think you can understand this artist without visiting here. Thomas Cole came up first in 1825 up the Hudson River. And this, at that time, was already the first tourism destination in America when tourism was a brand new thing. And the famous Catskill Mountain House Hotel had just opened right on the precipice of the Catskills, just overlooking this whole valley. So he'd heard about this beauty. When he came here, he was a bachelor, And he started to get to know the family that lived on this property here. It was a beautiful farm with lovely views, and he started renting a spot here on the property for his studio in the summers. And during that time, we say he kind of fell in love twice. He fell in love with the Catskill Mountains and with Mariah Bartow. She was a young lady living here in the house and was the niece of the owner. Right now, we are in Thomas Cole's old studio. That's what he called it, because across the lawn, he built himself a fancy new studio a few years later. But this is where he ended up doing most of his best work. So he really came to this studio where we're standing and spent most of the day here. And some of his letters explain that his children would come and his wife would often sit nearby and read to him while he was painting. He found that to be very inspiring. And in one letter, when he was away from home, he talked about missing his daughter coming in to kiss the angels in his paintings. So he really loved his family as well. But he really had to travel a lot in order to be successful. You know, he couldn't FaceTime with patrons, he had to go. And so he was frequently in New York. He traveled twice to Europe, and he missed his family terribly, but that was the way for him to have a successful career. He supported not only his own wife and then their kids, they ended up having 5 kids, but also his own parents, his many sisters. And so all in all, he was supporting a very large number of people on his very successful painting career, but it was always very concerning to him that he would bring in enough money for everybody. His sister Sarah was a real confidant of his, and they had a great rapport. Their letters go back and forth talking about their struggles with painting, and they give each other advice and encouragement, and it's really a good, very supportive relationship. And then Thomas Cole's daughter, Emily, had a wonderful career as a painter, and she painted both on watercolor paper as well as porcelain. And she became very well known as a porcelain painter. And in her obituary, it doesn't say Thomas Cole's daughter, it says porcelain painter. So, and she sold her work and joined prestigious academies and really was quite a success. This property was about 100 acres, and he would walk everywhere when he was living here. So other people might take a carriage, a horse and carriage or whatever, but he walked. And he walked about 10 miles from here to the base of the Catskill Mountains quite frequently, and then walked up into the Catskills. And oftentimes he would spend the night there, just camping out, because in the morning he would catch the sunrise looking east. And we have one of the sketches of the sunrise in the house. And there's really no other way to get that view than to spend the night there. And he wrote in his journals extensive descriptions of these hikes in the Catskills. And he was just euphoric in nature, just absolutely gobsmacked with the views and the beauty. And he felt really close to something divine in nature, that in his view, God had just created this, and we get to experience it without any interference. And so it was before Darwin, so they didn't know that the earth evolves and changes, and so does every species. He thought it was just like this at the dawn of time, and he had the rare opportunity of coming across it unchanged.
Cole settled in the Catskills, in Catskill, New York, and just grew to love the region. He studied every tree and every trail and every mountain. Actually, it's where he brought his students, Frederick Church and Asher B. Durand, and he would, introduce them to his obsession with the careful study of nature. So from his farmhouse porch, and you can actually visit the Thomas Cole home site today with his studio recreated. It's a wonderful, wonderful site to visit. He could stand on his porch and look out over the Catskill River. And he would spend every day looking at the scene. And just as he was finishing the Oxbow, he wrote to his major patron in New York, Luman Reed, that he called them the copper-hearted barbarians are cutting down all the trees in my beloved Catskill Valley to create a railroad. And he was like horrified. And it came to realization in that year. And so interestingly, his impulse was to paint a landscape view that preserved the pre-railroad, pre-destruction of the forest view that he admired so much. So when you look at this painting, it's the most idyllic, Edenic view with a young mother and child. And I should note that he had just gotten married as well. And so there's a young man coming out of the woods, a young hunter, and that's probably a self-portrait of Thomas Cole. And he shows you the scene exactly as he saw it, and using Claudian elements, the framed trees, the foreground, middle ground, background, the beautiful Catskill Valley. But it was, but at the time, his writings were just he was enraged by what was happening.
In addition to being a painter, Cole was also a prolific poet and writer. His moving essay on American scenery was published in American Monthly magazine in 1836. The Catskills, he wrote, have varied, undulating, and exceedingly beautiful outlines. They heave from the valley of the Hudson like the subsiding billows of the ocean after a storm. Beyond documenting the landscape, Cole sought to employ it as a means of illustrating important moral messages of environmentalism and the Word of God. To Cole, God wasn't confined to church. To feel God's presence, he had only to be in nature, which made the destruction of nature an act of desecration. We are still in Eden, Cole mused in his essay. The wall that shuts us out of the garden is our own ignorance and folly. With sin, atonement, and human nature on his mind, Cole conceived, in 1840, of the Voyage of Life. It begins with an infant and his guardian angel emerging from a cave into the morning light. The world blooms with his arrival, and he greets his journey with open arms. Soon, he casts his angel aside and sets sail alone on the River of Life in youthful arrogance. He gestures toward a heavenly palace in the sky, but his path toward it is long and winding. The river becomes violent as faith is lost and doubt seeps in, and yet our pilgrim is never truly alone. In his old age, he humbly reunites with his angel, his boat ragged and his hourglass gone. The light of salvation punctures death's darkness, and his voyage comes to an end. In 1844, Cole acquired a young student, Frederick Edwin Church, who trained for 2 years at Cedar Grove before he went on to become one of the most celebrated landscape painters of his generation.
Of course, the most famous artist to come here and stay is probably Frederick Church. So Frederick Church was just 18 at the time, and Thomas Cole was a little reluctant to take on a student at first. He wasn't sure he wanted to be a teacher. It wasn't really an idea of his, but Frederick Church had the recommendation of one of Cole's patrons, and so Cole agreed to take him on, and it turned out to be one of the best things he ever did.
Across from the Rip Van Winkle Bridge connecting Catskill and Hudson, Church's monumental home and studio, which he called Olana, lords over the river, still in dialogue with Cedar Grove on the other side. Running along the bridge is the Hudson River Skywalk, one of 20 destinations on the Hudson River School Art Trail, a curated itinerary of historic houses and lookouts that were significant to Cole and his peers. The Thomas Cole National Historic Site, the Olana State Historic Site, and Catskill Falls are also must-see sites along the trail.
They had I was going to say a lifelong friendship, but it turned out to be a life-short friendship because Thomas Cole died when he was still only 47 years old. But then Church kept friends with the family and supported them after Cole died because they didn't then have a source of income, and really took care of them. Well, right in this room, he painted the Voyage of Life. As you can see behind me, that shows the scale of the painting. We put a reproduction on the easels to show this was a big series, and he had 4 of these going at once in here, so you can imagine the logistics would get a little bit complicated. But also in here, he did a lot of his best-known works. Anything that you can find by Thomas Cole, just about from 1839 until when he moved his operation into the new studio in 1846. So he was very excited to finally build this elegant Italianate style, fancy, high-ceilinged studio. He considered this temporary because it's in a barn. I mean, he is a man of achievement and sophistication, and he wanted a fancy place. So he finally got this beautiful new studio and then died just over a year later. The new studio right now has a lot of the works that were in that studio when Cole died prematurely at age 47. And at that time, everyone expected him to have, several more decades of major productive time in his career. I mean, it really, at that age, you're kind of at the height of your powers or about to launch into what could be the most amazing work of your life. And he unfortunately died right then. So in there right now, you can see this energy about to take off. He has studies for major works he was planning to do. And there are half-finished paintings that are enormous. And it's just really, I find it very inspiring because it's a picture of somebody about to achieve great things.
I think his work is a reminder, and the history of his work, the reception of his work, is a reminder of the essential need to know history and to study history if we are ever going to break from that cycle of the rise and decline of empire. We need to move forward, not back again.
I guess what I admire about him most is when you look at his self-portrait in the Oxbow, he really understood that an artist in the New World, the United States, could play a really important role in reaching the public and conveying important messages to them about the direction the country was taking. And he could try to warn them based on his own knowledge, of what their fate might be if they didn't really honor nature in the way that he did.
Despite his tremendous impact on early American art, Cole didn't live for very long. In the winter of 1848, he died rather unexpectedly from pleurisy at the age of just 47, leaving behind an unfinished series, The Cross and the World. Much is taken away from the charms of nature when such a man departs, mourned the poet and Cole's friend, William Cullen Bryant. To us who remain, the region of the Catskills, where he wandered and studied and sketched, is saddened by a certain desolate feeling, and we see that something of power and greatness is withdrawn from the sublime mountaintops and the broad forests and the rushing waterfalls. Withdrawn, he clarified, but not extinguished, because to Bryant, Cole's death marked his rightful return to nature. In his poem titled Thanatopsis, named after the Greek word for meditation on death, Bryant reminds us that death is part of the natural order of things, that when we die, the earth reclaims us and makes us earth again. After Cole's death, Durand was regarded as the leading American landscape painter. In 1850, he created this glorious landscape, now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, inspired by Thanatopsis and by Cole. But Durand would soon pivot to favor the English painter John Constable's less sentimental, more naturalistic landscapes, which he saw as the future, and he laid Cole's artistic spirit to rest as a relic of the past. In the wilderness, the mind is cast into the contemplation of eternal things, Cole once wrote, sublime things, even more astonishing than life or death. Because it's eternity, says Edmund Burke, that we understand the least, and is therefore the most affecting, the most sublime of all ideas. So Durand guides our gaze beyond the earthly realm and off into the golden haze of eternity. What lies beyond the horizon? Who knows?